Well, welcome to part two of the rest of the story. And as we continue our study of the social justice narrative, we will attempt to continue to get understanding and clarity. So the outline today, just briefly, I will mention a few words about the Black experience shared by Shelby Steele. Then look at the book Bloodlines by John Piper. And from that, get into just a brief explanation of the concepts of personal responsibility and systemic intervention, and then finally talk about the power of the gospel. So here are a few words from Shelby Steele, written in 1990 from his book, The Content of Our Character. So keep in mind, this is 30 years ago that he wrote this. He said, the condition of being Black in America means that no one will likely endure more wounds to one's self-esteem than others, and that the capacity for self-doubt born of these wounds will be compounded and expanded by the Black race's reputation of inferiority. And Black skin has more dehumanizing stereotypes associated with it than any other skin color. And then skipping down, being Black, it's the most despised race in the human community of races. And to live, it means to live with a relentless openness to diminishment and shame. So these are strong words coming from a Black man, and one that is really rather conservative. And even he is saying that to be a Black man in America is to have to live with these dehumanizing stereotypes, being despised, and having this just relentless shame. So, you know, we have to listen to these words and we have to grieve for our Black brothers and sisters who are living through this. I'm hoping that things have gotten better since 1990, but, there's certainly no guarantee of that. But Shelby Steele also talks a lot about victimization. So he completely admits that, he wrote those words that we just read, that racism and discrimination is real. But at the same time, his parents came out of the civil rights movement. That's where they met, and he was going to marches as a child. And he said that, growing up, he identified with the anger of those movements because he was in a segregated world and he was denied all sorts of opportunities. And so he was a vociferous participant in that Black Power movement. But something changed his mind. And he said a lot of that was just attributed to growing up, having a family and bills to pay, and having to have a job to take care of them, just ordinary things of life. When he just realized that there was a great deal more freedom in American society than he had previously owned up to. And his life was pretty much in his own hands. Now, again, he reiterates that's not to say that there isn't any racism. He still meets it every day, but it's simultaneously true that he has an enormous amount of freedom and that he can pretty much take whatever direction in life that he wants. And that's why so many people want to come to the United States. No, it's not perfect. If you're Black, you're going to face this racism, but there still are opportunities here. And the other piece of this for him was the message that he gave his kids. He says, it seems to me that the worst thing in the world is to tell your children that they don't have any freedom. This victim-focused identity is that Blacks will end up telling their own children that things are not possible for them, and that guarantees defeat. And he couldn't stand that. Now, he admits that you can make victimization itself a kind of currency of power, and it does work. And it brings certain benefits, preferences, and entitlements. But by rewarding victimization, we encourage people to think of themselves just as victims rather than empowering them. And having to make your historical experience of injustice, of victimization, the centerpiece of your culture and your group identity pushes you down. And blacks today, they're freer than at any time in their entire history. Yet their identity is more grounded in victimization than ever. So he says, if my benefits come to me primarily as a black and not as an American, then the effect over time is to undermine common society, the common culture and democracy of America. I, as a black, don't identify with America. America is my enemy. They're my oppressor. They're the ones who are victimizing me. And this kind of thinking causes me not to move into the American mainstream, where I'm likely to be more successful. So that causes me to correspondingly fall further and further behind. And that's the tragedy of this victimization power. So you've heard some experiences from Shelby Steele, and next you'll hear some from John Piper. But you're hearing a lot from me, and sometimes it is useful to know about some experiences of the speaker. So just briefly, I'll touch on a few of mine that seem to be relevant to this topic. So the first one is my first black friend, which happened in junior high school. I had some Filipino Oriental friends previously, but my first black friend here in junior high, and we met at school, started getting close. He invited me to his home on a Saturday to just hang out. But I said I had to ask my parents first because my father was a carpenter and he often would take me with him on jobs. And it turned out he did need me on that particular Saturday. So I had to, go to school and tell him, nope, can't do it that particular Saturday. And his reaction just shocked me. He said, it's because I'm black, isn't it? And he almost started crying, and I could do nothing to console him. Uh, I was just a young kid myself and had no idea how to deal with this. So basically, I retreated. Um, we remained acquaintances, but we never became close after that. Um, but I'm sure he experienced some discrimination previously with other people, and he transferred that to me, even though there weren't any thoughts in my mind of that. But I suspect that that created some apprehension in me in the future of dealing with other blacks as well. But the next time I really had much of an experience with the black person was my freshman year of college. And I was taking an English composition class, and the professor was a black female. And this, to me, was a class that I should have been able to breeze through, but did our first composition and I got it back. And although grammatically everything was perfect, my prose was atrocious, according to this professor. I just didn't know how to write, and overall, I was getting like C's. And I tried to take her comments to heart and change what I was doing. The second paper just got the exact same comments back, and I'm pulling in my mother, who's pretty talented herself, my brother, who was a journalism major, and we're working on these things. And third time, I get the exact same comments. And we try again a fourth time, and someone else actually wrote the paper, I'll admit, just to test what's going on here. And we got the exact same comments again. Now, we're all pretty disheartened here. And one thing you need to know about me is I hate to quit. And I was getting advice that I just needed to drop this class based on what's happening. But that's not the way I like to operate, but they convinced me and I did. So the only class in college I ever dropped was freshman English. But, it affected me in a lot of different ways. Certainly I had failed in certain ways previous to this, but, this new experience going into college, and this wasn't the only class that had weird things going on in it. I just needed to reevaluate my identity. And I think long term, this actually ended up being a positive experience. It made me much less fearful of failure and made me understand that this isn't the end of the world. This is just one class, and other things that I encountered later on, I could also say the same thing, and a lot of it just comes down to, you know, I'm in Christ and he's going to love me. He's going to care for me regardless of what I do in freshman English or anything else. So the third experience was actually a job application. So between my junior and senior year, I applied for an internship at a government research lab. And I thought that I had good credentials, and my mother had, her employer had a friend who actually worked there, and he hand delivered the resume and he said it looked really impressive. So I was expecting to, at least get some feedback, but I never heard a thing. And it just always puzzled me how it is that I got no response whatsoever. Now, this research lab actually is close to where I grew up in Ohio. So, there's also some thought, you get your foot in the door, maybe you can actually get a job there and stay close to home. Well, that didn't work out. I ended up in graduate school and was in Virginia. But, a couple years had passed and I'm back home for Christmas break and happened to be watching the television, and on comes this announcement that the head of human resources at this government lab had been arrested because he was taking resumes from more qualified white applicants and throwing them away so that less qualified blacks would get the jobs. My response was, oh, well, that explains it. I didn't have any ill feelings one way or another about it. It was just kind of a relief to understand what had happened. My life had moved on. No, I didn't have a job, but I was in graduate school and had a pretty good research position there. So things had worked out. So it just didn't matter that much to me. My mother, on the other hand, was quite upset because she was really hoping that I could stay closer to home. But one point I want to make here is just that people can be discriminated against regardless of what color they are, and how they deal with it is really important. And it's often difficult to deal with it in the right manner. Even for me, like the English composition class, and it may have been discrimination simply because I said I was an engineer. It's still hard to deal with. And it's often really important that we have people around us who help us and point us in the right directions so that we just aren't thinking that the whole world is out to get us, that everybody's against us, that no matter what we do, somebody's going to trip us. But instead, when we realize that, no, there are people there who will help pick us up even if we get tripped, that can make it so much easier. So now I want to talk about John Piper's book, Bloodlines. And part of this is going to be about John Piper's personal story, his life experiences, and part of it's going to be about the power of the gospel to transform lives and the world, in particular about this issue of racism. So John Piper grew up in South Carolina in the 60s, and he readily admits in his younger days he was manifestly racist. He assumed the superiority of his white race in almost every way. He did not want to know anybody who was black except Lucy. Lucy came to his house on Saturdays to help his mother clean, and John liked Lucy. But the whole structure of the relationship was still demeaning. And he says that, if you think that, say, Southern slaveholders could have good relationships with their slaves because, they maybe had affections for them, he said it's naive because there's still elements that made the relationship degrading. Now, I'll interject a little bit here. John's mother had a very good, positive relationship with Lucy. John Piper had a very superficial relationship with Lucy. So I think part of these comments are about his personal relationship with her. As we'll see later on, his mother had a much different relationship with her. And I think that could be true, of any relationship. But, he says that the whole family was nice to Lucy and they loved her. And she was even invited to his sister's wedding. And his mother even made sure that Lucy sat in a nice prominent seat for the wedding. But in John's mind, the relationship was good as long as Lucy and her family knew their place. And if you're thinking that way, there really isn't honor, respect, and equality before God. And he said his affections for Lucy did not provide the slightest restraint on his racist mouth when he was with his friends. But he readily admits his demeaning attitude towards blacks was not his parents' fault. He said that his mother would have washed his mouth out with gasoline if she had known how foul his mouth was racially when she was not around. But what was around him, the other kids he was hanging with, they pushed him in this direction. And even his church, there's a kind of implication of them. He says, in 1962, my home church voted not to allow blacks into the services. And the civil rights movement is starting here, and the excuse was they just don't want to have any political issues arising. That's the only reason a black person would want to come to their church, is to make a political statement. And I just put a note there. He wasn't going to a Southern Baptist Convention church, but in 1963, only 11% of Southern Baptist Convention churches would admit blacks. But John says that when his church had that vote, according to his recollection, his mother was the only one who voted against that motion. And he's very thankful for the conviction and courage of his gutsy Yankee fundamentalist mother, because she was showing him the right way to respect blacks. So his awakening really started in college. He's going to Wheaton, and he attends the Urbana Missions Conference in 1967. And a conservative Baptist foreign missionary, Warren Webster, he was working in Pakistan, and a student asked the question, what if your daughter falls in love with a Pakistani while you're on the mission field and wants to marry him? Well, he had no problem answering that. His response went like, better a Christian Pakistani than a godless white American. And that struck John Piper. And he knew he had a lot of homework to do. So he started investigating this. And he also knew that the perceived wrongness of interracial marriage had been for him one of the unshakable reasons why segregation was right. And clearly, this missionary had told him that interracial marriage is perfectly fine, and what's important is who knows God. So while furthering his studies, he took a class that had a 208-page syllabus of readings called Readings in Racial Prejudice, and he found them shocking. And, part of one of them went, and now let us listen to the groans of Frederick Douglass, feel the lash with Amy, endure the satire of Du Bois, and measure the wrath of Malcolm X. Let us contemplate the pathos of Black childhood and the tragedy of Black womanhood. And let us not forget that Martin Luther King Jr. said, "He who passively accepts evil is as much involved in it as he who helps to perpetuate it. He who accepts evil without protesting against it is really cooperating with it." And that struck him. And, he continued to study, and then he took a class where he wrote a paper entitled "The Ethics of Interracial Marriage." And in that paper, it was essentially the settling of the matter. And he has not gone back on what he said there, that the Bible does not oppose or forbid interracial marriages, but it sees them as a positive good for the glory of Christ.